Welcome to this class on the critical interpretation of literary texts, a field that goes far beyond simply reading a story to pass the time. When we enter the world of higher education, especially within technical and associate degree programs in the United States, literature ceases to be mere entertainment and becomes a fundamental technical skill. Imagine you are faced with a complex contract or a technical proposal at work. The ability to deconstruct the logic of a difficult poem is precisely the same ability you need to understand the subtleties and pitfalls of that professional document. We are not talking about an empty aesthetic exercise, but rather a systematic study that has integrated throughout the centuries philosophy, history, and ethics to help us understand how meaning is constructed in our lives. Historically, art was seen as a mere reflection of nature, a way of imitating what we saw outside. However, today we understand that literature functions differently. Literary language is a special organization, almost a way of subverting ordinary language to intensify it and distance it from everyday, functional communication. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a genuine interest arose in understanding what makes a text literary, a concept we call literariness. This shift allowed criticism to move beyond mere personal taste or subjective impressions and begin to scientifically study how texts function as autonomous systems. In the United States, this development found fertile ground in what we call New Criticism, a movement that taught us to analyze literary works as complete structures of meaning that we must understand on their own, without depending on the author's life or the events of their time. This is crucial because today, leading academic accreditation institutions require students to develop rigorous critical reasoning skills. It's not just about understanding what the text explicitly says, but about drawing inferences and navigating ambiguity, skills that directly transfer to solving professional problems where data is often incomplete or even contradictory. When a student learns to manage the complexity of a text, they are preparing to manage the complexity of the professional world. Therefore, this module's main purpose is to bridge the gap between basic literacy and the critical literacy that the current environment demands. We live in an era of constant information overload, where being able to discern between superficial information and deep subtext is essential for performing ethically and effectively in any technological or professional field. To achieve this, we rely on various critical lenses that function as focusing tools. For example, if we apply formalism, we focus on the text as a pure structure, paying attention to how rhythm or word choice creates a sense of estrangement that forces us to see reality in a new way. It's like when we analyze a poem by Emily Dickinson and realize that the unusual use of dashes is not a mistake, but a tool designed to fragment the flow of language and force the reader to perceive time and death from a completely different perspective. On the other hand, we have approaches like structuralism, which doesn't seek a single message, but rather universal rules or binary oppositions, such as light and darkness or nature and culture, that make any message possible. It's fascinating to see how we can apply this approach to folk tales and realize that, beneath their surface, they follow identical narrative patterns from the hero's departure to their triumphant return. Deconstruction, as proposed by Jacques Derrida, invites us to go further by questioning the idea that a text has a stable center. It teaches us that language is a constant interplay of differences, where meaning always seems to be postponed. Imagine reading a foundational legal document and discovering that the word equality, which seems solid, logically depends on a prior exclusion that causes the entire argument to crumble under rigorous analysis. Alongside these approaches, Marxist criticism reminds us that literature is a product of socioeconomic conditions and an arena for the struggle for power. When reading a work like The Great Gatsby, we stop seeing it as a simple love tragedy and begin to identify it as a critique of the immobility of social classes and the emptiness of a system based solely on capital. Similarly, feminism and gender studies allow us to investigate how literature has historically been used to marginalize and how women writers have responded to patriarchal structures. Analyzing a work like Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper allows us to denounce the imposition of oppressive medical treatments on women, transforming the text into a powerful metaphor for mental oppression. Postcolonialism, for its part, compels us to examine how the discourse of empires has shaped the identity of dominated peoples, using terms like hybridity and subalternity to analyze power relations in works such as Heart of Darkness. This kind of analysis is fundamental for developing empathy and intercultural understanding in a workforce as diverse as that of the United States. We also have reception theory, which is fascinating because it shifts the focus from the text itself to the interaction with the reader. Here, the text is not a finished product, but rather a series of instructions that the reader must fulfill, filling in the blanks according to their own ideological framework. This perfectly explains why the same novel was received in radically different ways in the northern and southern United States during the 19th century. Likewise, New Historicism proposes that literature is not isolated, but rather one document within a network of social discourses, like the laws or medical journals of a given era. By reading Shakespeare alongside the navigational treatises of his time, we begin to truly understand how the idea of empire was negotiated during the Renaissance. We cannot forget eco-criticism, which questions our anthropocentric view and helps us understand how culture imagines the ecological crisis, seeing figures like the whale in Moby Dick not only as a symbol of evil, but as a real ecological actor in the face of industrial exploitation. Meanwhile, literary psychoanalysis searches the text for manifestations of unconscious desires or traumas, interpreting the obsession of characters like Ahab as a manifestation of deep anxieties. Queer theory helps us challenge norms about sexuality and gender by identifying subtexts that break with heteronormativity, while narratology teaches us to be technical in the mechanics of storytelling, analyzing how time and the narrator's voice construct the mystery necessary for a plot to work. Finally, intertextuality allows us to see that every text is a mosaic that dialogues with others, and stylistics allows us to observe how an author's minimalism or brevity reflects psychological states such as stoicism or trauma. To ensure this doesn't remain purely theoretical, we must transform it into a methodical and auditable process. First, we conduct a close reading, beginning with a preliminary observation where we identify vocabulary and determine the speaker. Next, we look for patterns, such as repetitions of images or words, that allow us to infer and connect these patterns to broader themes. The final step is to draft a thesis statement that is specific and defensible. We don't want a descriptive summary, we want an interpretation that requires defense. To write it, we follow the point, illustration, explanation structure. That is, we begin with a topic sentence, present textual evidence, either a quotation or a paraphrase, and then explain how that specific use of language supports our thesis. We must never let the quotation speak for itself. Along this path, it's normal to make mistakes, such as confusing the character's opinion with the author's, which we call the biographical fallacy. To avoid this, we should always speak of the poetic voice or the narrator, never of the author as a historical individual. We should also avoid excessive use of the first person, as we want our statements to be objective and authoritative. It's very common to fall into the trap of orphaned quotations, those we include without introduction or explanation, so I recommend applying the quotation sandwich technique. We introduce the quotation, present it, and then analyze it thoroughly. Another frequent error is ignoring ambiguity, when in reality, if the text is contradictory, our thesis should focus precisely on that contradiction instead of trying to hide it under a forced interpretation. At the end of the day, all this effort translates into a greater capacity for making evidence-based decisions. Businesses highly value information literacy and subtext analysis. A professional capable of deconstructing the logic of a difficult text is a cultural mediator and an analyst able to navigate the complexities of our globalized communication. Critical interpretation is not an academic luxury. It is a tool for intellectual empowerment that prepares any citizen to participate in a democracy that depends on rigorous reasoning and constructive dialogue. Every time you analyze a text using these tools, you are training your mind to identify rhetorical strategies and implicit elements in any argument you encounter in your daily life, thus becoming critical thinkers capable of thoroughly exploring ideas and evidence before drawing any conclusions. This is the path to moving from being passive recipients to becoming active citizens and analytical professionals who understand the complexity of the world we live in.